possible here. What a move by Duda. He's going to move. Oh, he's lost some time.
And Wesley shakes his head. He just
even in the end, I mean, he could have tried, but at that point, Duda had consolidated 2 points ahead. Look at this performance in the early going by JKD. Incredible defense. A chance missed by Wesley, but as you pointed out, Robert, that is so hard to see.
Yeah, this is just something that when you have the eval bar on, you see that Rook F to E1 is zeros, but it was almost +2. Hey, now you have to think outside the box a little bit. I'm going to store that one. I'm going to write that down later to use in future lessons, because Rook D to E1, what a clever way to go forward. And Danya, this opening that we have now in game 4, Wesley shows pawns well advanced in front of his castled king. That can backfire, but it also can use to restrict the pieces. For instance, we see a bishop on G3. We know that's not the best bishop, because all of these pawns on the dark squares make it pretty useless on the diagonal. But how do you feel about these positions? I think that the light squares, in particular F5 in the future, could be a problem, but I now pass it over to you because you're going to be able to explain this better.
Well, I play this with black, and the Italian is the kind of opening. Of course, it was all the rage in the 1700s. My boy Gioacchino Greco and all those early masters, and then there was a period when people sort of at the highest level switched to the Rai Lopez, and now it's all the rage again because it's a very rich opening. It's a very hard to understand opening. There's a lot of subtle ideas. Now, of course, the square on F5, Robert, is very weak. White can strike in the center with D4, and black's position can collapse very quickly. On the other hand, black has very specific ideas in relation to it's sort of a blitz in football, right? You're rushing the quarterback. If he gets the pass off, okay, he's probably going to find a receiver downfield, but he might get sacked. And the equivalent of that is H5, H4 ideas, F5 ideas. Black is going to try to mount that blitz before white gets his knight to E3 and plays D4. Is he going to manage to do that? That's why he played knight G8. He's trying to open up the passage for that F1. Here we see it. Will Duda be able to respond to this precisely?
Right, and if he gets D4 in, not only can he avoid a concussion, but he can cause some harm to his opponent. So this is a position where black is in some danger of having pushed too far, overextended on the king side, which is the nature of the way you play this opening from Wesley's perspective. And for JKD, another decision, do I take with the rook or do I take with the pawn? If he takes with the pawn, he has to think about E4 as a possibility at some point for black, saying your pawn E3 will be a weakness rather than a strength. And if he takes with the rook, he has to look at this rook on F8 as, is that a strong rook, or is it just looking good on a semi-open file? So now the file is fully open.
I was just checking to see the last year in which the New York Giants won a game, but my research failed me.
But I mean, the Giants have won 3 games this year, and just so you know, I grew up as a Jets fan, and the Jets have won 0 games. So,
man, I grew up as a 49ers fan, so I share in the plight. But in any case, are we supposed to be commentating chess, or is this?
You're the one who made the unnecessary football rules. Usually it's sports that makes it's a stalemate out there. And I'm always like, stalemate, the game is over.
Right.
So it's not a stalemate, right? Like, I just want all announcers in sports, if somebody sends us them, just so they know when they call the middle of a game a stalemate, because neither side is making progress, that's not a stalemate. Just the game is over.
Continue the rant. I'm completely on the same page. To continue when somebody lets tell Al Michaels and all the John Madden, Bill Belichick and Jim Harbaugh are engaged in a chess match here. It's going to be a real chess match. They're going to try to checkmate it. That doesn't tell anything about anything that's happening. It's just the most generically used term in sports coverage ever. But
how would you feel if they were like, they're engaged in Zugzwang right now? You'd be like, wait, what? What's going on here? Like, imagine if they use that correctly.
I do appreciate it when chess is used, but it's interesting that these terms stalemate and checkmate have made it out into sort of the common sports comparison vocabulary. I don't know. It's just interesting. But Wesley's the one trying to deliver checkmate here. I don't think he's going to succeed.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. But the knight on F4 does look very good. The bishop on H2 still does not look particularly promising. But what JKD is holding on hope for is D4. You mentioned this idea. It is thematic in the white side of the Italian game. Can I get D4 in and break open the position? But Wesley's just creating many problems along this F file where he has just better control.
Yeah, and here comes the doubling on the F file. And what does he manage to do here? What he's managed to do has been to sort of close off the center, minimize the impact of White's pluses, and maximize the impact of his own pluses. In particular, that knight on F4, incredibly strong. It can be replaced by a rook should it be captured. He's definitely better here. This is a big chance for him. Bishop h5. What Duda can try to do here is move the knight away from f3 and basically say, okay, we're at a stalemate. Come at me, bro, because I've got that bishop on h2, assuming that defensive role, putting the brakes on any potential g4 move, because that weakens and softens up that f4 knight, which can be captured. So
that was very well played, Danya. That was extremely well done. You're right, though, that if you can move the knight, let's say knight g1, play g3, even though it makes your bishop look not very good on h2 for the time being, if you could trade off most of the heavy pieces, you're not getting yourself in any trouble. And for Wesley, how does he actually increase the pressure here? He says, my knight on c6. Let's just go back a half step. Knight on c6 dominated by a pawn 3 squares away. Let me reroute that piece. And knight to g1. So he's trying to get g3 in.
Yeah, sorry. And I just found out Klay Thompson had Achilles. Okay, I'm kind of devastated. But anyways.
Yeah. That was sad news yesterday. I'm sorry.
I did not hear that. This is just the first time hearing about it.
G3 would be a big blunder, though. Knight takes d3 is a problem now.
Yeah, so bishop c2. Okay, back to the game. What Duda's trying to do is shore up all of his potential weaknesses. That bishop on c2, we say the bad bishops defend, and g3. That's a very committal decision. Look at that bishop on h2. There have been better bishops in the history of bishopdom, but the plus side of this is bad bishops defend good pawns, said Romanian Grandmaster Mihai Shuba, great chess author, by the way. And that pawn on g3 is fulfilling a crucial role. It's covering the f4 square. Look at the knight on h5. It isn't too happy either. So Wesley trying to find alternate ways into White's position, sacking the pawn to soften up that e4 pawn.
Yeah, I think Black's position looks excellent because while White is holding off Black's pieces, that's the best way to describe it. White is not attacking. White is not threatening anything. There's nothing of consequence that Black needs to be on the lookout for. In fact, everything that's weak in the position is what White has to defend rather than the other way around. And look at this, taking on the f-file, saying I can control the f-file if I want. The queen had to stay put, defending the e4 pawn, and hey, knight f6 wins the
knight f6. Directly. Yep, knight f6 is going to be very nasty, very hard to deal with. Wesley trying to see queen f7 check. If he can do that in a better way, he can. He's going to take on c4, and he's going to attack e4. This is excellent work here in this middle game by Wesley, patiently poking and prodding, and then seizing the opportunity. Will Duda be able to coordinate his defensive forces? This is looking pretty grim, but I wouldn't rule it out. Knight takes c4 check.
Nice.
Ooh, he's going to lose. I mean, bishop e4, queen e4, and some chances there for White, but should be losing, I think.
Yeah, the bishop is so weak on h2, and if you play g4, I don't even have to go knight f4, but I can think about it. So this bishop, a bishop 3 squares away from a knight certainly dominates it, even more so than a pawn does. The knight on h5 clearly better than this bishop on h2, and Black is up a pawn. Better pieces, more material, and a minute extra on the clock looks good for Wesley's chances.
Yeah, and knight f6 here is possible, trying to reroute the knight to g4, the newly created weakness. In general, in the endgame, it's a good idea to fully understand and burying the bishop on h2, and the pawn on g3 is now a permanent weakness. It's a good idea whenever a pawn is pushed to understand which weak squares have been created. That tells you a lot about how you should position your pieces. Here, for example, Black now has the f3 square. He can situate a bishop there potentially. He can also bring, I mean, there's just so many attempts there. b5. I just want to be careful when you push pawns not to trade too many of them. So We'll see how he plays this. He is, as you mentioned, Robert. Yeah.
I'm looking at the king. You mentioned the f3 square. I was thinking the king could also try to get into f3.
Oh, absolutely. There's room there for 2. Well, no, there's room there for 1, but the knight on e4 pressuring g3 now.
I like the point you were making about not trading too many pawns, or at least being aware of which pawns you should trade, because now b5.
Knight c3.
Oh yeah, knight c3 wins a pawn. No, not trading pawns.
But then bishop c7 at the end.
Good call.
How about so tricky?
I also want to play d5 and then bishop b5 check, but the problem is, we can analyze it later. But
nice.
If I take on f1, which I wanted, the king would have taken on e4. So
but knight f6 in the end of that line instead of bishop takes f1.
Oh, so maybe
we can show that later.
Yeah, maybe d5 was good. We're doing that whole GM thing where we're just analyzing to our own benefit, and everybody has to be like, what are these fools discussing right now? This pawn on g3 remains weak. but the knight on f1, stabilizing that for the time being. The bishop on b6, it was such a bad bishop before. Now it's doing quite a good job on b6, stopping the b7 pawn from moving and covering the length of the diagonal.
Yeah, and Wesley's so good in these positions. His technical skill is basically unparalleled. And here comes the sun. Here comes d5. Now, bishop b5, trying to, of course, dislodging the knight from f1, but knight e3 check, and then the bishop assumes the defensive role from e1. Duda doing a great job apportioning his limited resource here. The problem is, Robert, you called it. I think the king is coming in through e4 to f3, and that is going to be a doomsday scenario for white, is that king is going to wreak absolute havoc on the defensive forces.
The big issue is the g3 pawn is a weakness that can't be moved, and you don't take on e3. I would not go about and do that.
Actually, it might not be so bad. Not king e3 and e4.
You're saying that you're too quick.
I think it's winning, but I wouldn't risk it, and he doesn't.
Yeah, that's definitely the safer play here. And the knight can come to f. Oh, but then there's knight d6 check. What I'm trying to highlight is you don't really want to trade knights, because a single extra pawn in an opposite colored bishop ending gives the side with the material deficit good chances to hold. So knight f5 allowing knight d6 would not be good. He instead of king f3 giving the e5 to win g3, and that gives you a nice pass pawn.
And bishop d6, Duda, last-ditch attempt, but that's pretty effective, Robert. King takes g3 you don't want to do, because it would have lost the knight, instead setting his pawn in motion. But now the bishop from d6 guards g3, but he has a bigger problem to worry about. That's the e-pawn. And knight f5 in the picture, 2 seconds on the clock. He's not making it happen. No, yeah, and it's over. Winning. And a great game, a great recovery by Wesley, taking a bite out of that early lead, winning with the black pieces in an Italian. That was a great game, technically, very precise. And you mentioned it, he's very hard to tilt, very hard.
Yeah, right after losing 2 of the first 3 games, going down by 2.5 half score, you would think, hey, does he feel like he has to win? Does he have to do something really impressive? He did push his pawns from his king, but that was part of a standard opening setup, and then he went forward from there. And look at this game, right? Now we're in a territory where white has trade off the queens, even material, but pawn structure is not symmetrical, and white is first to the threat, right? Bishop to b6 hits the rook. This rook on d1 is attacking a bishop. This rook is stuck defending said bishop. And I'm not saying that black is in huge danger, but you have to know what you're doing. And there is an opportunity after rook d7 to play a move like knight c5 and potentially get the bishop pair as we head in more towards the ending, or play a move like c4 to kick the bishop. It's a lot to work out here if you are JKD.
Yeah, and this move rook g1 on the 6th move of the Najdorf is a move that that basically has made a resurgence recently. It was really popularized by Ivanchuk. My research tells me it was first played in the year 1990 by the Yugoslavian international master Goran Todorovic. And it was played several times in the early 90s, popularized in the late 90s, but it's sort of been retooled in recent years after Garry Kasparov, Najdorf specialist, made a dent in it. So interesting to observe the sort of opening fashions here. And like you said, Robert, I think white's developed some very unpleasant pressure here with bishop h3 ideas, bishop c5. Duda's got to keep his position together.
He does indeed, and not easy for him, clearly. He's spending clock, but that has been a theme, a trend, I should say, of the longest time patrol. Duda is every single game down a minute on the clock, at least. And right now, no exception to that. He's down a full minute. He still has plenty of time, right? 3 minutes and 49 seconds for a blitz game. Pieces have been traded off, but Wesley moving instantly. So Danya, knight c5 played here. What to respond with? I don't want to take you.
Yeah, maybe you have to, though, takes and rook d8. I mean, at the very least, you get rid of the immediate initiative, but you do acquiesce to the fact that white has the 2 bishops. What else is there? I mean, if you move the bishop from e6 to, let's say, f5, then, well, that paves the road for the f1 bishop to jump out onto c4. So he does take. Yeah, and I like that decision.
And I also like the follow-up, king c7, because what was such a thorn in black's side was this bishop on b6. Well, no b6 square for you. In fact, black, if he so chooses, can eventually play b6. As you mentioned, rook to d8 is possible. There's also, I was going to say, h6. Why does my rook need to go to a different file? Instead of going to the open file directly, let me create an open file for my rook and then try to make use of it.
And white can try to close that down with a move g6. That, of course, creates its own liabilities because such a change in pawn structure is a very responsible decision, right? Black can play at f5 or something. But I'm leaning toward g6 here. I feel like allowing the opening of the h-file, Robert, is something just feels a little bit off about that. I mean, g takes h6 is probably a draw, but I think Wesley's shooting for more here. He's definitely contemplating g6. Will he play it?
I feel like he won't. And what?
Let's just strike that from the record.
I just wanted to prove that you would be right. So if I said something, it's the opposite is going to happen. But the reason why I didn't like g6 and now h5 to follow is these pawns are closer to where black's pieces are going to go and could fall in the endgame. The reason I like them is if you can imagine that the rooks get traded, this bishop obviously would come to f8 and then try to get to the g7 pawn. There could be sacrifices that allow this g pawn to spring free. Very long story, but something to keep in the back of your mind.
Winner na sana. Kaso, oh my gosh! Switch to Head & Shoulders. Get rid of excess oil and dandruff so you stay fresh while having fun. Head & Shoulders.
I am much more concerned about the h5 pawn than I am about any of black's pawns.
No, I think you make a very fair point because for the time being, the rook on d8 is very stably holding that. That f8 square is what you really need to watch for. If a bishop lands there, as you said, it's not going to be good. The other thing to watch for, if the bishop from e3 eventually sacrifices on h6, with that bishop being on e6 covering the promotion square, it's going to be very hard to make that work, but still something to watch for. And Wesley deciding to keep that line of negotiation of the f8 square open, maybe bring the bishop back to c5. But I like Duda's activity here, and I agree with you, Robert. I have to say, even though I predicted the move, I'm beginning to lose quite a bit of faith in White's position. That rook on g1 really tied to its place because bishop g4 is going to be such a disaster.
That's certainly true. And I'll add that the pawn on g6 may look good, but the pawn on h5 does not. So it's very weird. And typically we say that a pawn chain is only as good as its base. The h5 pawn, it is a bit difficult to get to. It's on a rook file. That means it will take quite a bit of energy to go after it, but it's not that easy to defend either. And rook g3 played, causing Duda to sit and think. Is there some kind of rook to the queen side coming? Is there a c3 or a c4 push that will allow you to take advantage of your queenside pawn majority? I just like the placement of black's pieces better. Look at the knight on d4, bishop on e6, rook on d8. Harmonious piece placement for Duda.
Yeah, I was just finalizing a pun, so hence my delayed response, but I'll share that maybe after the game because I know it's going to make you cringe. But now the rook does. He takes the plunge. He says, all right, I'm going to go for activity come hell or high water. By hook or by crook, I'm going to create some chances against the black king. And I actually really, really like that, particularly in the context of the time situation. He's got a minute and a half extra and maybe something like a4 to add heat to the position. He doesn't have a lot of time to spare, Robert, because bishop g4, let's not forget, is a very big threat. He's got 1 or 2 tempi at the maximum.
Yeah, because once h5 falls down, goes g6. But
Danya, king b2.
Yes, king b2 is certainly an idea. And I was going to say that your a4 idea, maybe giving up the kingside pawns to win the queenside pawns, then we have a race. And the bishops are very good in pawn races because they can both defend the king side and also attack the queen side. A bishop, for example, on the d5 square would be able to threaten the corner and defend the other one. So that's just why when their pieces go on both sides of the board, pawns on both sides of the board, I should say, having bishops tends to be a good thing.
Instead, prophylaxis by Wesley playing f3, accepting new weaknesses, but stopping, of course, the bishop from coming to g4. And Duda says, I won't be denied. He's getting his knight to f4. Something with that move f3 seems a little off. Now Wesley seems passive again, although he has shut off the immediate line of attack to the h5 pawn.
Yeah, and I was thinking rook c8, but I'm not sure I want to go into the rookless ending here. Trading off allows the bishops to shine. As king to b7, the rook c6 was the idea, and here's your a4 down. It's starting to look more promising for white. You're actually creating some legitimate threats, and rook d5.
Well, that pawn is fulfilling a very important role of guarding the c4 square, which could be used as a base for the bishop on f1. But the bishop on f1 could also move potentially to g2. Duda wants to shut that down with knight f4 in a timely manner.
Yeah, and actually now knight f4 is even stronger, and that's why the rook on d5 is nice, because if you take me on f4 and I take with the e pawn, I'm opening up the 5th rank and the h5 pawn.
And he's trying to exploit that diagonal f4. E takes f4 would be a very bad blunder due to bishop g2. What does Duda do? Does he close it down? He does with the bishop, but f5? Ooh.
That was clever, though, putting the bishop on e4. And f5 just puts another pawn on a light square, which I likely can go after later in the game. So,
or even immediately.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's an important decision here for Wesley, because if you take on e5, the rook takes, and well, thank you for giving me a direct attack on your h5 pawn.
Right. I was thinking some bishop g2, e4, rook d3 ideas. I mean, there are some ideas down the long diagonal. Actually, rook d3 here is not out of the question. Oh, it is, maybe. Yeah. Okay, that's too much.
I love it. I'm going to show it. Let's bring up the analysis.
Sorry, I'm going a little crazy.
No. I loved it. Bishop d3, bishop g2, e4. Danya's idea was if c takes, now this pawn is pinned, and if you take with the rook, thank you for your rook with the check. But of course, Black does not have to take on d3. Black can move the rook away. For example, rook takes h5, and then be up in exchange and move on from there. So nice idea, though. The tactics were almost working, and instead we saw the trade.
And we're seeing a repetition 2 times. Who is the one declining the repetition or thinking about declining it? I'm not actually sure. I think it's Wesley. Wesley's bishop g2 would lead to a draw.
And I think he should.
Yeah, I think he should too. He doesn't have any other chances. He might lose that pawn otherwise.
Right. And this rook on e5 now is superb. And he allows the... Wait, it's not a draw yet?
It is.
It's a draw. Okay.
That's a good decision. And we talked about this. You know, Wesley realizes